Hi, everybody. My name is Linda Marsa. I'm one of the organizers of this event. I'm with SoCal Science Writers. I want to thank all of you for coming out here today and those of you who are tuning in virtually. This is really an important event because what we're trying to do is build a community here. Those of us who are tuning in and those of us who are here, we know what's going on with climate change, but the rest of the world simply does not. You know, they're going about their daily lives and there's a lot of disinformation out there. And we need to somehow get the word out, you know, and it's not just all doom and gloom. There's a lot of really positive solutions out there. But one of the reasons that we wanted to do this event was we wanted to start building a community and really creating a conduit between us as science journalists that write about climate, that write about the environment, that write about the health of people living in this changing environment, and the activists and the experts that are doing the research in this, and really start to get the word out about what's happening. So I'd like to thank, people have done just an incredible amount of work pulling this together. And I don't want to sound like an Oscar acceptance speech and name everybody, but they know who they are. But one person that I do think needs to be singled out is Brian Cohen, who is chairman of the Science Literacy Foundation, and he's the one through the Science Literacy Foundation that funded this because he truly believes that through science journalism we can maybe break through the logjam of disinformation. So anyway, Brian, if you could say a couple words and kind of explain why you did this, it would be really great. But again, thank you all for coming. I'm sorry that we started a little bit late. And unfortunately, our keynote, Kristen Torres Pawling's husband had COVID, so she has taped her keynote, which we will have right after Brian talks. Anyway, thank you, Brian.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Linda. So you all have dreams, and dreams are what the future is made of, and trying to figure out how to actually make those dreams happen is a huge challenge. I'm a trained science journalist some 48 years ago, and I began my life to communicate science, but with one word, really most important key word associated with the word communicate is understanding. Because people are communicated to, right? You all hear things, you all read things, but do people really understand things? And what I learned about that key word understanding is that it is the ultimate bridge builder, and it's also the ultimate way that community is built. Because when everybody works to understand something, it's a long-term process of communicating to others, who then communicate to others about what you should really understand and learn. So as I was doing this, I found myself at this time of my life looking to make a big impact, right? We're in the world of impact these days, social impact, and the creation of a foundation to begin this process. This is the first. COVID certainly has put a damper on a lot of activities that we've all had, wanted to do, but Linda, being the force of nature that she is, particularly in the science journalism world, was able to amass a great deal of the science journalist community to take note that now they, as journalists, in the old world they couldn't actually become activists, but now there's really no choice. Journalists, science journalists, they are and will continue to be and grow to be the mouthpiece to create that understanding. Public, politicians haven't really succeeded. Educators have tried in the world of science literacy. It used to be the more you learned, the more science literate you became. But we learned that did not work. It's very emotional to me. Science journalists have the tools, both searching for what? The truth, right? And having the ability and the knowledge to investigate. And three, having worked in the field for a number of years, not to tolerate BS. And so what we're beginning here, what you're here for, what we're looking to try and accomplish is to get science journalists literally around the entire United States. I'm from New York. We're going to be doing another conference like this in New York with NYU. We're looking at University of Chicago. We're looking at Missouri Journalism School. But it starts here with you. And so if there's anything you want to share with me about the concept of science literacy and the full force of the use of science journalists around the United States, please share it with me. It's really important. We've got a bunch of people online. Hello, everybody online. I'm looking forward to learning, as you're learning, to create one word, understanding, so that we could share that with others. So thanks for coming. Thank you again, Linda. Thanks to your team. Fabulous. And I guess you're going to do the opening keynote. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, my name is Kristen Torres Pawling. I am a Sustainability Program Director of the County of Los Angeles in the Chief Sustainability Office. I am not coming to you from CLA live at home.
Can you pause it for 1 second? Hi, everybody. Yeah, if you could just pause it. I just want to let people know what we're watching. Kristen Torres Pawling is Director of Sustainability for the County of Los Angeles, and originally she was going to be our keynote, and as I mentioned earlier, her husband got diagnosed with COVID yesterday, so she recorded this at 2 in the morning last night. But so she is up in the corner, and it's kind of a small thing, but she does have her presentation in here. Anyway, so go ahead, Mike. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Kristen Torres Pawling. I am a Sustainability Program Director with the County of Los Angeles in the Chief Sustainability Office. I am not coming to you from UCLA Live. I am at home. I am currently the sole caretaker of a rambunctious 2-year-old because my husband has COVID right now, so I cannot be there with you, unfortunately. But let me start by thanking the organizers, the SoCal writers, and the Science Literacy Foundation for the SoCal Science Writers and the Science Literacy Foundation for hosting this, sponsoring this West Coast Climate Crisis Symposium, and for their hard work in organizing this event. It's a thrill to be the keynote for today. So a little bit about me before I go really into the themes I want to address today. I started my career actually as a journalist in middle school. My very first paycheck was covering some local news. So I myself, at one point in my very early career, had been published in a newspaper. So it was funny for me to, I enjoyed thinking back to that very small blip and minor part of my career. But moving towards past the point when I earned, a degree. So my climate work began at the state level. I was working for Mary Nichols at a time when AB 32 had recently passed, and there was major questions about how California should pursue this groundbreaking, around the world followed approach that came after AB 32. So what should we actually do to realize these climate goals? Since then, I've worked in regional government, state and local government currently, with some smatterings of times in advocacy and consulting. So I bring up my career trajectory because it reflects some of the themes that I'll be discussing today of how do these big picture goals, what do they mean at the local level, where people's lives, are the connection between people's lives and their government is a little bit more tangible. And I'll also start by saying, because this is another theme, you all as science writers know this, but I think it is worth repeating. We're here to talk about the climate crisis, which is one of the biggest challenges facing humanity this century. it's an ongoing crisis that we're seeing, unfold more slowly than this long slog of a pandemic. But we've seen heat wave after heat wave, major inundation after major inundation, drought after year of drought on the West Coast. So you all know this, but again, it is worth saying that we are here to discuss this rather heavy topic. So I do want to just acknowledge you for doing this work, because it's hard to do day after day. But you wouldn't do it if you didn't think there was some reason to be optimistic. So I salute you for that work. And for those of you who are not from Los Angeles, joining us from other parts of the West Coast or elsewhere, I want to welcome you to Los Angeles, and here along with my friend Clayton Kershaw. So this is a photo from the hottest World Series game ever played on planet Earth, which was 103 degrees on an October evening in 2017. Dodgers won that game. The rest of that series is, I guess we're all West Coast friends here. So, I think we're all upset about that. And I won't even go any further than that because I'll just spend the rest of this hour talking about the Dodgers. But so I'm going to be talking both about climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation and resilience. And from the perspective of somebody who started my career in state service, but now is at this local level, working on climate policy. So I'm bringing you that LA spirit, that California approach to this work. So let's dive right in. Since many of you are journalists, wanted to start with the big news. Some people might say the biggest news in climate these days, at least in LA, is our mandatory water restrictions, to respond to our increasingly severe drought. But if you're more deep in the weeds in the climate policy side, then like myself, the California Climate Change Scoping Plan is the big news. I'm just going to highlight a couple ways that it's been covered so far. Cal Matters does excellent reporting in this space. Shout out to Cal Matters. But you've probably seen coverage, if you're following this topic, about offsets, allowances, the market-based mechanism, and the way that it would proceed out to 2045 for the state to achieve carbon neutrality, and the scenarios that the California Air Resources Board has run to put together this draft scoping plan, which, for those who don't follow it, is really supposed to be the framework, the guiding document about how the state should pursue their various regulatory and other mechanisms for meeting the stated carbon targets, climate targets. So here, this report, this particular story is talking about offsets and allowances, and another one from Cal Matters talking about how the plan is flawed according to some key advisors, the arguments happening between carbon capture and sequestration, whether that's well understood or poorly understood. You can find experts making both characterizations of the scoping plan. So that's the news version of what's going on with the scoping plan. Has a clear, two sides arguing, good story there. But when I was at the Air Resources Board, I worked on a different part of the scoping plan. And I have some, the photos up of each of the now, I guess 3.5 scoping plans that have come to pass. The state is required to draft a scoping plan, or the Air Resources Board specifically is required to draft a scoping plan. And that every 5 years. So the first one, starting the clock in 2008. 2008 was our first one. So we've had 2013, 2017, and the draft for 2022, which is currently open for public comment. So I had the question of, I've lots of attention going towards the part of the scoping plan, justifiably for the piece that talks about the market mechanism. I had a question about what the scoping plan has said over the years about the role of local governments in meeting the slice of the emissions inventory that needs to be handled by local governments across California. So I've just pulled out some quotes from each of the plans over the years and the piece that they say around local government. The 2008 plan, the first scoping plan, what did it say? Quote here being, over 120 California cities have signed on to the U.S. Conference of Mayors Climate Protection Agreement. Over 30 California cities and counties have committed to developing and implementing a climate action plan. Well, that sounds good in 2008, right? We're chugging along and out of the gate excited. 2013, roughly 70% of California jurisdictions have either completed policies or programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or in the process of adopting them. Oh, we can cross out the 108, that's a citation. So while many local governments have become leaders in sustainability, there remains significant opportunity for local governments to take meaningful action. So starting to characterize things as, there's more balls rolling, but we aren't quite doing what should be done, is sort of how I would characterize the 2013 tone about local government action. So moving to 2017, here we're talking 60% of cities and over 70% of counties have completed some kind of greenhouse gas inventory. 42% have completed a climate, energy, or sustainability plan that talks about directly reducing emissions. Okay, more higher numbers. That's sort of the theme in 2017. Now this year, while climate action plans have become an important avenue for climate action at the local level, 47% of California cities and counties have no known climate action plan. And many jurisdictions find that performing or hiring consultants to perform a greenhouse gas inventory and developing a climate action plan itself is costly and time consuming, regardless of their desire to take action on climate. So now it's sort of flipped the script and talking about what is not happening and what share of California governments have not done what was expected or anticipated in the 2008 climate action plan, or scoping plan, rather. The 2022 plan goes on to say whether or not a jurisdiction adopts any type of climate action plan, local governments have tremendous opportunity to reduce greenhouse gases in these three strategy areas: transportation electrification, vehicle miles traveled reduction, and building decarbonization. Further goes on to list a chart saying these are the specific, these are the specific actions that local governments have within their authority to take. For example, adopting all electric building codes. So it kind of goes to be more direct of like, hey, if you can't do a climate action plan, would you please adopt this individual ordinance? So saying what hasn't been done and spelling out more clearly the tools and the particular ordinances that really need to be undertaken at the local level. So that's interesting, and I think notes a shift, and I think that there's a lot to discuss there, especially given local elections that are happening now, and excellent reporting here at the LA Times about whether mayoral candidates have had a climate strategy and what that means for voters. So switching gears a little bit to switching moods and vibes from the blood moon over Los Angeles from a few years ago. moving into thinking about local action related to climate, responding to the climate crisis. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the climate vulnerability assessment that we undertook at the County of Los Angeles, and some findings that we had there. Again, you're all journalists, so you start with punchline. More than half of LA County residents will be severely impacted by the climate crisis. Aaron Stone wrote a very excellent article covering this report that we issued late last year. Yeah, it's kind of startling. So this report, I'm going to talk you through some of the background information and then go into more detail on these findings. So the climate vulnerability assessment that we issued talked about climate vulnerability in a very specific way. So we're talking about exposure, the nature and degree to which a system, like a piece of infrastructure or an infrastructure network, excuse me, or a subpopulation is exposed to climatic change. How much hotter is it going to get, for example, and how exposed are you to that heat? Sensitivity is a degree to which a system or subpopulation is affected by that stimuli. And then sort of minus the adaptive capacity. How able is that system or that group of people to adjust given the exposure and sensitivity? Basically, how can you cope with the consequences? So that's what we were talking about when we say climate vulnerability. So the scope of this climate vulnerability assessment, we looked both at people side, population side, what are the social factors that drive someone's vulnerability to climate change across these categories: age and gender, housing and mobility, community and language, income and wealth, education, occupation, health, and race and ethnicity. And then there's individual indicators under each of those categories. And then there's the infrastructure. What are the pieces of infrastructure and assets and across the categories shown here: communications, medical and emergency, community facilities, transportation, economic centers, and I'll let you read the rest. But really, we examined a lot of our physical infrastructure here in LA. What did we find? Again, this is not shocking to anybody who's a science writer to know that Los Angeles is facing these 5 climate hazards: extreme heat, higher temperatures and longer days of heat, wildfires, larger, more frequent, more destructive, droughts happening longer and more often, inland flooding, which maybe you might, even if you are well versed in this topic, you might be surprised to know that we do expect an increase in inland flooding here with our wetter winters and drier springs. And then of course, coastal flooding. So more frequent and more severe events, even if given small increases in sea level rise. So go through these hazards one by one next to talk about how they particular groups and places. So we ended up with a list actually of 47 communities that are extremely vulnerable to climate hazards. I'm going to give you some examples of those kind of communities and why. So again, this is this exposure plus what are the sensitivities that make, what are the particular characteristics of a population that makes them vulnerable. So extreme heat, we're talking, Reseda and Winnetka in the San Fernando Valley. Extreme heat is what they're facing there. And then there's a higher share than average of limited English households. There's a higher share of people with health conditions. Long Beach and San Pedro, moving toward coastal communities. Extreme flooding from sea level rise is the hazard they're facing. And there's a higher share of low-income homes in flood zones. And Santa Clarita, an example of where there are 2 hazards being faced by this community: extreme heat and wildfire. and then higher proportion of older adults than average and lower transit access than average around the county. So moving into the particular hazards, extreme heat, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time on heat because it is so critically important to the Los Angeles region. So our highly vulnerable populations are people with pre-existing conditions, children and older adults, outdoor workers. And then the pieces of infrastructure that we're concerned about with heat are energy, parks and open space, and transportation. Mostly because those pieces of infrastructure are vulnerable themselves, but they are also essential at times of extreme heat to people. And just to spend a minute talking about risks to workers under extreme heat scenarios. Heat waves lead to surges in injury for workers. 1 in 4 heat exposed workers, and we're not necessarily just talking about outdoor workers, indoor workers can be heat exposed to, lack protections from heat illness and injury, such as paid sick leave or extra break time on hot days. And we found in some of our, we not just use quantitative data, qualitative data and listening sessions, we heard from workers that they fear retaliation about reporting incidents to heat and other climate hazards. And you'll see here a map of vulnerable low capacity communities. Oh, I'm realizing you might not be actually able to see my face. So here I am. Here's a map of vulnerable low-income communities in Los Angeles, and sort of hot pink is both highly exposed and highly vulnerable to respond to heat waves. And there's a connection between where people who are heat exposed at work and their homes, and where are they going back to, and if they cannot afford to turn on air conditioning, for example, after spending all day inside, say, a container, shipping container at the Port of Los Angeles. So places like Southeast LA, actually, where I'm from, are places with high vulnerability to heat and low adaptive capacity because the built environment is making it hotter. So communities like these are people who are employees of warehouses without air conditioning. So that's the kind of hazards that we're talking about. Wildfire. We've partnered with USC in a long-term survey that they do of LA residents called LA Barometer. And 40% of the population has already said that they've avoided going outside due to smoke in the last year. And we don't map exposure to wildfire smoke necessarily, but we know from survey data that it's truly impacting a large share of the population. And when we talked to stakeholders about this hazard, we heard it was so important to have emergency and evacuation plans that specifically support certain subpopulations. So people with disabilities, people who rely on caretakers, people experiencing homelessness. One example of somebody who was concerned about wildfire evacuations said he didn't feel like there was a clear place about how an evacuation for work for this person who was a power chair user. You would need a disabled access restroom or some kind of evacuation center. And then transportation that can accommodate this person's 400-pound wheelchair, even without this individual in it. So people don't necessarily feel the trust is there to, or that the emergency plans consider them for wildfire. Moving to extreme precipitation and inland flooding. So even though, we don't associate LA with flooding and lots of excess water, we do have it from time to time. And the extreme precipitation, sort of the whiplash we expect will make this worse in the future. So where flooding occurs is obviously influenced by a lot of things like topography. And we know that the existing federal maps on this topic don't actually take into account projected change in precipitation due to climate impacts. But so we know that this number that I'm about to share with you is probably an underestimate, but at a minimum, 700,000 people in LA County have some level of risk from inland flooding. And that includes nearly a third of people living in mobile homes and people living in group quarters. So there's a big connection between the housing type and risk to extreme precipitation and flooding. So LA County's coastal flooding, there's pretty localized direct impacts. Some areas of our coast will experience exposure to coastal flooding by mid-century of certain places up to as much as 4 feet in places like Marina Del Rey, Malibu, and Long Beach. So across the county, there's 47,000 people at risk of coastal flooding by mid-century. And that includes low-income people who will have a harder time recovering after these kind of events. We'll of course lose beach and recreation space as the shoreline moves up and all the economy related to that. And we have pieces of infrastructure like roads and bike paths that we would expect to see flood damage to. Droughts, here is the US Drought Monitor. I'm sure you're familiar with if you cover this particular part of climate. Drought threatening flora and that are used for medicinal and cultural significant purposes to indigenous and tribal communities here in Los Angeles. So that's one probably piece that we don't hear enough about here in Los Angeles. Excuse me, and our rural communities in our northern part of the county, when we were listening to their particular needs, they talked about reduction in irrigated landscape resulting in more heat and dust, which, dust itself is particulate matter. But there's also, very specific concerns about the spores that spread valley fever and the increased potential for valley fever in that region. So that's drought. And then, so that covers all 5 of them, but across the report, we found racialized vulnerabilities across all of these pieces. So I'm going to talk on heat. Latinos make up 49% of LA County's population, but in communities with high vulnerability to extreme heat, we make up 67% of the population. So half of the population on average, but 67%. In communities that are facing extreme heat burden. Disproportionate impact. In wildfire situations, some workers or workers of color were evacuated by foot or by public transit, which could take hours, which is really not happening for everyone. And then evacuated workers that we spoke to reported being exposed to wildfire smoke, and in some cases experiencing racial profiling as they are evacuating. Working conditions, Black Angelenos were more likely to work outdoors, to be unsheltered, and to be at greater risk of exposure to harsh environmental conditions during their work hours. One other example, financial instability. After a climate disaster, Black households we found were more likely to suffer greater wealth losses than white households. So I give these examples, and I actually was very intentional about this photo here, which was from an excellent series, and I think might have won an award from LA Times, Genaro Molina, in a series that a team of reporters did at LA Times. And I have spoken to an official in the Newsom administration who very specifically cited this series of reports around extreme heat that the LA Times did as an impetus for elevating extreme heat work within the administration. When the administration 2 months ago or so released an extreme heat action plan, there's a press release from the governor highlighting the action. And I have good information that was direct, that elevation of the response to extreme heat was from this set of reporting that the LA Times did and pointing out shortcomings that the state had made. in its response. So we also did, part of our report looked at what we called cascading impacts. How are impacts from one part of our infrastructure system related to climate impacts from another? And this is a big old map of our entire infrastructure system, sort of in node form. Don't need to read it other than each sort of color area indicates one type of infrastructure. So we tried to understand the downstream and cascading impacts for when infrastructure is disrupted by a climate event. So these are all interconnected. Obviously, we need water to generate energy, energy to move water, and we tried to take those kind of complexities into account. So we asked the sectors like emergency services, transportation, electricity, what do you need from other sectors to function well? So the arrows are these connections. Just skip this slide here. No, I didn't. One of the most important findings that we saw was electricity is critical. It strongly influences every other infrastructure sector in many ways. And power provision has the biggest direct impact on all other sectors. So that's a key cascading impact. And, another that, as we were doing this work, it was height of the pandemic. Workforce availability is also central. It connects almost every interaction in this complex network. As we learned, workers are essential because they provide a service, but they're also contributing to the functioning of our whole community system. So the role that workers play cannot be understated. And even when you're thinking just about physical impacts to infrastructure pieces, it's still human beings who are the essential piece. Again, thinking about the human being side of infrastructure. So even if we're covering this beat of infrastructure and climate change, there's always a human side to it. Energy disruptions disproportionately impact socially vulnerable populations. During climate events, climate disasters, vulnerable populations need more types of communication platforms more accessible. And that, going back to a point I made earlier, parks and open space, trees, and access to cooling infrastructure are critical and key to adaptive capacity. But they are in and of themselves vulnerable to heat, wildfire, and drought. So there are these very complex interactions happening in our system. So that kind of characterizes this report that we put together. So we have a report, which is this assessment, but we also have an online map and data tool, which has so much information. If you have data analysts who love this kind of stuff, would strongly encourage them to take a look at it. So to just sort of wrap up some reflections, I had a conversation with a group of UCLA graduate students in the urban planning department who were looking at climate adaptation indicators that we should consider for our office as we think about what it means to measure progress towards adapting to climate change. And I asked them, so what are the big pictures that you've been taking away doing this work? They said that the impacts are strikingly uneven. That was just a hard thing to get past when doing this work. And that the response to climate change's impacts to us now is very segmented. And if you're an urban planning student, you get to spend lots of time thinking about what is sort of wrong with the way we run our urban systems here. And they said this response to climate change piece is even more segmented than other issues that they examined during the course of their studies. They said, it's notable climate change is truly impacting everybody, especially the most vulnerable, but there will be impacts to everyone and parts of our economy that could be going to do other things. Wealthy people and well-off people will figure out ways and will be spending significant resources responding to climate change. So that'll be the interesting point. And then they came across some sort of basic non-intuitive responses to climate change are on tap for us. One of them being that we would focus on, daytime extreme heat for workers, which is absolutely a thing we should do. But then there's this issue of extreme heat actually is most dangerous for some populations at night. And because human bodies are simply not made to be hot during the nights. We have some ability to adapt during the day, but at night, if temperatures are not dropping below 80 degrees for days and days in a row, that is an extremely dangerous situation from a health perspective. So sort of preparing ourselves to say, especially on the heat issue, that it's not like hot isn't just like going on vacation, it's hot, I can handle it for a few days. Like there are real impacts that are dangerous. So those are just some reflections on doing this work after my time, my experience, plus thinking with some, young thought partners on this issue as well. So where do you go from here? If I can just sort of have some call to action for you all, I would love for more stories that daylight the ways in which, for science writers to daylight the ways in which communities are responding to climate change. And on the mitigation side too, there's really innovative work. If I could highlight the I-710 corridor win that frontline communities face there, that community groups have been calling for a zero emission goods movement corridor on the 710, which connects the good movement to the rest of America, honestly, and went through communities of color. It's one of our most pernicious environmental justice issues here. And I'd love to hear more about the ways that frontline communities are really talking about the reality of where we need to go. Profile these communities and the very specific needs. Our 47 communities, they rose up because they have specific needs and specific populations. And I think there's a lot of solutions that can be tailored to and bring new people into the fold to talk about climate change and come up with tangible solutions that come from community. Challenge leaders and ask them, especially elected officials in these communities, how they've responded to climate change and how they've prepared or not prepared. Both, again, on the mitigation side, the scoping plan is sort of going this tone, taking this tone anyways of, wait a minute, we don't have enough action being taken. And then I do not think are fully, the literacy around the types of impacts that communities are going to face unless there's very, very drastic change. I would love for some very deep dives into this cascading impacts topic. I just think there's so much to unpack here. I don't think we barely scratched the surface there. And then just the big picture, please continue to do your work. Covering the climate crisis is hard, but please do continue and persevere through what is a really challenging space to cover. And of course, every writer and every journalist is a climate writer. And I think that climate vulnerability assessment sort of speaks to that. If you have a colleague who covers children or older adult issues, like there are climate issues there too. So I will pause here and say thank you for having me. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you, at least virtually today. That's my Twitter handle and the LA County Chief Sustainability Office's Twitter handle, our email address, and then the link to find out more about our work. So want to, again, say thanks for joining me in the opening of today's West Coast Climate Crisis Symposium. Thanks so much.
So we have Kristen on Zoom. So we have time for a few quick questions. Are there any questions that people would like to ask Kristen? Anybody? Well, I would like to ask, hi Kristen, good morning. Thank you so much for doing this. How's your husband feeling?
It's day 2 of COVID, so less than great, but me and my daughter are still fine.
Okay. One of the things I wanted to ask you, I mean, you talked about, the fact that, communities of color are most affected by climate change. Which areas in LA County would you sort of single out? I know down in Long Beach and the Port Complex, they have a lot of problems with air pollution. What are some other areas?
Sure. So I'm from Southeast LA, and Southeast LA, came up on that map of where workers are living who are exposed to heat during their workday. And so I think that dual burden of having to have really high exposure and is not just the place where you live being the problem, really the place and the conditions under which you work. And those people, that population who has to deal with both of those burdens tends to be in Southeast LA. That's one of the communities. That's a big area. That's an example of how much there is to unpack about. It's not even just where people live. It's really thinking about where they are during the day as well. Hi.
Can we meet her? Because she's the reason we're doing this.
Oh, sure. Olivia, you want to say hi? We're working.
Hi, sweetheart. Hi, honey. Hi.
She can't see you all, so she's like, I just see myself on the screen.
Well, I mean, really, this is the reason we're doing this. It's for her.
Yeah.
For her future and stuff.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So when you talk about drought, I mean, what are we looking at? Because, I've done a lot of work on drought as a science journalist, and, I've done a lot of work in Australia, and, Australia has no water. And they're implementing so many things to do to conserve as much water as possible. And it seems like LA County is just now starting to embark on things. What are some things that can be done that you see in the offing? I mean, they have toilet to tap down in Orange County. One of the things that I saw a lot of in Australia was, gray water catchments, and they certainly don't have the kind of green lawns that we do. So what are we looking forward to in LA County?
Yeah, I think you certainly see sort of the dawn of a new era, as of a few days ago, June 1st here in LA and for Western water districts. So excitingly, the new Metropolitan Water District, which is our wholesale water provider for the region, just hired a chief sustainability, resilience, and innovation officer. And she had just spent time, she was actually working with us for a little while before that, and had really been doing a lot of this work that our office feels is really important, of connecting with cities and sort of smaller joint powers authorities, that kind of thing within LA, because not all of them have capacity to keep up with the latest innovations from Australia, for example, right? Like many of these local governments, and on the water side, there are over 200 water districts here, like water providers in LA County, so that we have this like really fractured governance system around water here. So that, I think some of these governance questions, and having somebody whose job now is resilience for water at the wholesale water scale for Southern California, is really important. I'm so looking forward to the work that Liz Crossan will be able to undertake there. So I think it's some of these, maybe less interesting, but some of these like, wow, somebody needs to be in charge question. Some of these really governance, and that's my perspective. I'm sort of the policy wonk government side of things. So I sort of have faith in that type of approach. But I'm really excited about her work, and having spent time with us and really being part of our team of addressing these questions holistically. And certainly we're going to need all those strategies that you just outlined.
Does anybody have any questions in the back? Hi.
Communication. Oh, sorry. How much of the solution, and thank you very much for an excellent presentation, and I hope everybody gets well soon.
Thank you.
How much of the solution is really about getting the word out? We believe in this conference that science journalists are a mouthpiece, and that you need to work, and they need to work more closely with you and your team, and literally take more of an activist role, because you can do all the research you want, you can create all these plans and speak, but unless the communities out there know exactly what to do, how to actually move forward, and feel comfortable and capable to do it, it kind of doesn't, people aren't listening as much. So we're trying to get an army of science journalists, science communicators in the LA community to listen to you, to talk and collaborate together going forward from this conference, and build and build and build, so that all these communities can share and learn from one another. So is there a way that you have fostered an opportunity of working with more communications people, and how much is that actually part of the solution? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a great point. Thanks so much for raising it. That that's not necessarily how that's not the standard, right? I think that's pretty obvious that takes innovation, resourcing, and new kind of partnerships. That is certainly not the MO of how government agencies do this work. And I think it actually, when we were I didn't speak too much to our sustainability plan. No. Yes, here, you want this? Our sustainability plan, which is actually the overarching guidance document for the Chief Sustainability Office, came up out of a sort of bottoms-up approach, and really reflects the input of hundreds of community organizations and cities and companies of a vision for a sustainable Los Angeles. And it would, I mean, it doesn't surprise you, but it might surprise, sorry, hold on a second. Doesn't surprise you, but surprises others that a lot of the input was people need more education, and can you do that? And we actually, I sort of ascribe to like ourselves, our little 7-person team. We can, put out our social media content, but we are certainly not the science communicators. And we'll do our blog and our Twitter account, but that's the level of resourcing that we have, and we're working on trying to expand that sort of in-house. But certainly that's not going to be enough. I always like to talk about how there's a reason why Coca-Cola still advertises. People still need to hear things repeatedly over and over, and we're never going to compete sort of with the private sector level of messaging that people like what people do learn through those kind of processes. So we certainly need. I'd love to explore sort of a concept of a science communicator advisory table or something like that, where we sort of have regular convenings and check-ins, and we talk about sort of our latest work and some of the questions that are open for us. And people do expect someone to be doing this communication. It does sort of hurt my soul a little bit to hear from people when they say, like, we need more communication and education and literacy in this topic. But I've worked in government long enough to know it really probably should not be the government. It should be outside partners that have more training, more capacity to do that kind of work. So yeah, absolutely happy to explore and join that army.
So how many of the people in this room want to be part of that army? Raise your hands. I think we've got everybody here. So as soon as
Great.
you want to, and I know Linda will enable it, but to have a council of science communicators, environmental communicators, all science communicators work with you to get the word out so that everybody understands what the challenges and issues are. That's great. Thank you so much for that. That means everything to us.
We have one more question. We have time for one more question.
Hi. I'm from Portland, Oregon, and a professor there, Vivek Chandas, did a study going around the city with his heat gun, measuring the different amount of heat in different neighborhoods. And he found that, of course, in poor neighborhoods, in communities of color, the heat was so much higher, and that was primarily because of tree canopy and street trees. Are studies going on like that here and in other cities about looking at how greenery impacts heat?
Yeah, so first, definitely. Thank you for bringing up that point. There is an organization called Tree Poop. People can't hear the question. Okay, so I heard the question really well, and I'm also hearing a little bit of an echo, but so I'll repeat the question. Is the speaker was referencing emerging studies in Portland identifying heat impacts by community and by communities of color having disproportionate impacts, and what studies were going on locally in LA for that kind of line of questioning. And yeah, there has been work done. Tree People is an organization here that had explored that question. And actually the UCLA graduate students project that I referenced, they recommended measuring urban tree canopy as an equity-centered approach to talking about whether we've made any dent in preparing for climate change. And we have a really great geospatial team at the county. So we actually do have some pretty good data on that. And we also have, people have such an emotional, connection to trees that we also hear about it when a particular like mature tree comes down, including and especially in communities of color. So it's not just this, like everybody feels this connection to trees. So we have this sort of ground truthing, and there are ways for us to collect sort of frequent data on urban tree canopy health. We are also in charge of working on an issue that is, I don't know how much is being faced in Portland, but I know it's going on in other parts of the West Coast, that we have an increase in invasive pests that are impacting our tree canopy. So even if we are actively adding more trees, there's a lot of like urgent tree removal that's needed to contain these pests. So it is a real, which is, of course they're here because of climate change. So it's a real challenge. And I think it's going to be a very good indicator of whether we have sort of worked together enough, had done the science to understand how to tackle both this invasive pest problem and actually put trees where they're really needed. And also, we know that, sorry, no donuts right now, that there are other interim measures which are not as good, but shade canopy and other types of solutions, especially at schools where we just really need immediate change, are also part of the solution. But I think yes, urban tree canopy, and especially in community color, is so important.
Anyway, I'm sorry, we're going to have to cut this off. We're running out of time here, but